Welcome back everybody to another episode of Direct Comparison. In today's video, we're going to take an in-depth look at the recently released BioShock collection for the Nintendo Switch, and see how it stacks up visually to the trilogy on the PC. Now, before we get started, it should come as no surprise that the PC version of these games will look visually superior in just about every way. But the goal for this particular video is to see just what sacrifices the development team had to make in order to get these three games running at an acceptable performance level on the Switch, and how those sacrifices may have impacted the quality of the experience. For this analysis, the PC versions of these games are running at their highest visual settings at a native 1440p resolution, while the Switch version is being recorded in its docked mode. However, I'll be making a few tweaks to the resolution for the PC version to help determine if any changes have been made to the quality of things like models and environmental textures. Alright, now to kick this comparison off, let's start by going over the two biggest differences you'll notice right away: the resolution and performance. After doing some pixel counting, it appears that the BioShock collection is using a dynamic resolution, sitting in at around 720p all the way up to the Switch's native 1080p, depending on what's happening on screen. When playing in portable mode, the game's average resolution is even lower, with the max being 720p. As for the performance, it does seem that the Switch is running each of the three games at a locked 30 FPS, with no option to unlock the framerate like you could in the original 360 or PS3 versions. While certainly a disappointment, especially for those coming from other current-gen platforms that have achieved 60 FPS in this collection, the 30 FPS lock is at least stable, surpassing the terrible performance offered by the original 360 and PS3 versions that released way back in the late 2000s. And of course, having that experience be completely portable is a nice bonus. But aside from the lower locked framerate and less than stellar output resolution, BioShock on the Switch retains all the bells and whistles featured in other available versions of these games. Character models, for example, are pretty much identical. You won't find any difference in the geometry or texture quality here. This splicer, for example, has the same poly count and details, only they're a bit harder to make out due to that lower resolution. And when we drop the resolution of the PC version to match, sure enough, we get a nearly identical image on both sides. The same is true for every character model in the game, both during actual gameplay and during cinematics. And while this certainly holds true for BioShock 2, Infinite is handled a lot differently, and the overall texture resolution appears to be lower. On the bright side, there's been no decrease to the time it takes for bodies to disappear, and no reduction to the amount of NPCs on screen, ensuring that the game plays exactly as you remember it. Next up, we have our environments, that, just like the character models, appear practically untouched on Nintendo's handheld. Going into this, I fully expected a lot of the environmental detail to be reduced, with lower res textures and less physics-based objects throughout these unique game worlds. But after going through several different locations in all three games, everything seems to be exactly where it should be. All the same details, textures, and geometry are identical between games, with only a few incredibly minor hiccups throughout, like the torn edge to this banner, or this distant seaweed that doesn't seem to render as clearly. You'll also notice that a lot of the textures will appear slightly blurrier on the Switch side, but after reducing the resolution on the PC, you can clearly see that this is just a result of the game's output resolution, and not the quality of the textures themselves. With BioShock Infinite, these differences become even more apparent. Infinite, being the most demanding of the three games, has a lot going on in each scene, and so objects like this hot dog appear less complex on the Switch. Now, let's talk about the lighting for a bit. The Nintendo Switch version of each BioShock shares the same lighting techniques offered in other releases of the games. There's baked light maps and light volumes in the first game, a few spotlights mixed into the sequel, and more volumetric lighting and dynamic effects in Infinite. And because it uses the same techniques, this new version also suffers from the same graphical hiccups that can be found in the original release of Infinite. Many light sources seem to have these broken light shafts, for example, that repeat the light image several times in a strange way, which can be easily observed in the Clash in the Clouds DLC. There's also some problems with the quality of the reflections, especially in Infinite's opening sequence. These reflecting pools look fantastic on the PC, but on the Switch, there's a noticeable shimmer when moving the camera that's difficult to ignore. Additionally, the quality of Booker's reflection at the base of the lighthouse has some really bad aliasing now. Next up, we have our shadow effects. Again, nothing has really changed here that can't be explained by the change of the picture resolution. Shadow effects are mostly pre-baked and simplistic, though there are a few areas where the NPCs cast very detailed projections, like this splicer standing over a baby stroller, that holds up fairly well on the Switch. However, with BioShock Infinite, the quality and complexity of shadows does seem to be toned down a little bit, and the ambient occlusion effects aren't quite as distinct as they are on the PC. Then of course we have our effects. The BioShock games are loaded with all sorts of effects, from electricity to fire and water. But with the Switch, it does appear that many of these effects were toned down. This seems to be one of the few visual elements that have taken the biggest hit, as many of the plasmids and their flashy effects appear more pixelated now than they ever used to. It looks even worse when in portable mode, especially when lighting splicers ablaze with Incinerate. Water effects, however, seem to be mostly intact. Reflections aren't quite as impressive as we've discussed before, but otherwise, all the water simulation effects in the first two games, along with the sprites used to create splashes and the cascading waterfalls pouring through the leaks in the structures, are all rendered exactly the same way. The only time I noticed a major drop in quality in terms of water was the massive window breaking at the start of BioShock 2. The wall of water that consumes the player looks much less complex now, and things like particle effects have been toned down slightly. The effects just don't hold up very well in this version of the game, which is a real shame considering how important they are to BioShock's presentation. Finally, let's wrap up with a brief sound comparison. Which version of the game do you think has the superior audio quality?
And living there is the lily pad. It's 3 too many, it's 3 too many, it's 3 too many, it's 3 too many. You killed my job!
It's Ryan! Goddamn Andrew Ryan! You found him! Damn it! They shut off access to Neptune. There's another way to get there. Head to medical. What are you waiting for? Go! I didn't mean to hurt him! It's Ryan! Goddamn Andrew Ryan! You found him! Damn it! They shut off access to Neptune. There's another way to get there. Head to medical. What are you waiting for? Go!
Daddy, big sister doesn't want you playing with me. Shh, Daddy. Big sister doesn't want you playing with me.
On the streets. And worse is the insult, because today is the day that marks our secession from the Sodom below.
Whoa! Damn hook must be magnetized.
the streets. And worse is the insult, because today is the day that marks our secession from the Sodom.
Whoa! Damn hook must be magnetized.
And that wraps up this episode of Direct Comparison. Overall, BioShock on the Switch is a decent port of this classic first-person shooter trilogy. With it, you get an average 720p to 1080p dynamic resolution, along with a fairly solid locked 30 FPS, which is obviously not great when compared to every other current-gen platform capable of playing BioShock, but it's still reasonable in regards to the system's hardware limitations. But thankfully, all the visuals seem to be completely intact. There's been no degradation of character models or environments, and the lighting and effects, while not perfect, don't detract too much from the experience. The only real complaint I have for this version of the game then are the controls. I've never really had a problem with the Switch's control scheme before, but with this game it just feels off. The Joy-Cons simply don't feel good for a first-person shooter, and I frequently ran into an issue where my character would slowly walk forward without any input at all. What's even stranger is that the buttons for interacting and healing have, for whatever reason, been swapped for this version, meaning you have to press B on the Switch to heal rather than A. It's almost as if the developers assume the button placement for the Xbox controller are in the same place on the Joy-Cons and assign the same values. But this feels completely off in-game, and there's no way to switch these buttons in the game options. Additionally, this version of the BioShock collection now includes a pointless 2K account DRM that will throw up obnoxious disconnect messages every now and again. I really just don't see why this needed to be incorporated at all, especially for a system that's intended to be portable. So now the question remains, is the Switch version of BioShock worth picking up? Well, if you own other current-gen consoles and don't care about playing on the go, no. The Switch version is probably the least impressive version of the game on current-gen hardware, with a lower resolution and lower performance. But if you've never played this series and only have access to a Switch, then it's absolutely worth checking out. And the added bonus of being able to take the series on the go makes this collection all the more enticing. But what do you guys think? Are you happy with the presentation and performance of BioShock on the Switch, or were you expecting more? Let me know in the comment section, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos posted every week.